opportunity to discuss this project. The project is at the preliminary design phase, otherwise known as PD, which is 30% design complete. The project design team is Weston & Sampson with the lead engineer, Mr. Mike Joyce. The project limits are from Unico Bridge to French Street. This meeting is being taped and is also on Zoom. Questions will come first from the audience and then from Zoom. You can ask questions on the chat function on Zoom, and we'll read them out loud for everybody to hear. You can comment tonight and also up to 14-day comment period following the meeting. Individuals may leave a question or a comment with the project manager by emailing Mr. Mike Joyce, and he does have his business cards at the front. At this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Mike Joyce of Weston & Sampson.
Thank you, Jerry. Welcome, everyone. First, I want to say thank you to the town of Watertown for selecting Weston & Sampson as an engineer for this project. It's a nice, exciting project for us. My name is Michael Joyce. I'm a licensed professional engineer in the state of Connecticut and the project manager for this project. I'm going to recap a little bit and go through a little bit of procedures with a little bit of the meeting tonight, too, for those who are online who want to join the meeting and participate with us. As Jerry mentioned, this is the Steele Brook Greenway. A little bit different than your other sections of Steele Brook Greenway because this one's going to be a more formal paved surface with a more formal connection between French Street and Unico Fields. We've already done our introductions. For those of you who are online, there is an option to be able to submit chat functions. What we're going to do at the end of the presentation, we're going to answer questions from the audience, and then we're going to read back into the record those questions and also read back any questions that have been submitted online so we can then answer them for the public record. As we mentioned before, all these comments, this public period, if something occurs to you tonight or tomorrow or next couple days, you have 14 days to submit a comment via email to the town or to me via the email that's on the invitation. If you go to the website, this presentation is there, so that information will be there for you as well. As I'd like to start off any kind of public information meeting, sometimes preliminary design projects come in to tell you what the project's going to be. No, I consider this a meeting an invitation. This is to get people in the town to participate in the design. We're at PD. We try to inform the design. You're here every day. I'm here partially here and there, but you're going to be here every day. You're going to use it, and you're going to love it. We want to hear what your feedback is for it so we can get the best design for the town that we can because you are the users that we're trying to design for. Tonight's agenda is going to do a brief introduction to the project area, talk a little bit about the funding program that's being used for this project, a little bit of project history of how we got to where we are today, talk a little bit about the existing conditions to get people familiar with the project environment, and then talk about the trail improvements. Following that, we'll talk a little bit about the potential right-of-way impacts the project has, and Zach Areno is online tonight as well to help explain the procedure because Connecticut DOT is going to manage the right-of-way acquisition process for the town of Watertown. And then we'll talk a little bit about construction costs and what's up next, and then open it up for question and answers, and then wrap up our presentation from there. On our slide in front of you now and on screen, we have the rough limits, as Jerry mentioned, Depot Street to the west or north. North in this particular orientation is up and to the left. And then Unico Fields, which is accessed off of Main Street, Route 63, coming off down near the dog park. The line in yellow represents the approximate proposed route coming from Depot Street intersection down to the parking lot that services Unico Fields today. You can see Watertown High School up onto your upper right, and then Watertown Plaza is just below the yellow line. This program is being funded under the Infrastructure Act. It is a 80%, 20% funding. It's going to fund the design, right-of-way, and construction phase for the project. Federal administration, highway administration funds 80%, and the town of Watertown funds 20%. Partners in coordination of this project are also with VHB, and Mark Jewell, who's online tonight with us as well. VHB is the Alternatives Program Liaison. They act as an arm of DOT to help administer these projects through design and construction. Project history, we were officially retained by the town of Watertown in 2023. We initiated survey really early to get out there and get survey information on the project corridor before a lot of what you'll notice is invasive species that's built up along the brook, so we could field identify certain features and also identify wetlands and other features that we need for project design purposes. Since that time, we've done survey, we've done geotechnical investigations, we've done the wetland delineations, we've done an archaeological and cultural investigation. VHB is coordinating the tribal coordination as part of the federal funding. And then we've designed the preliminary trail and the pedestrian bridge that's going to cross Steele Brook to make continuity from French Street down to Unico Fields. October, November, Jerry's scheduled several meetings with town staff, emergency services to go through and identify any local needs that the people maintaining and servicing and access this area might need, and they've provided some valuable information that we'll take forward with us into our next stage of design. When we talk about the cultural and natural resources, the regulatory requirements we have for this program are under Section 106, National Historic Preservation Act, and then Section 4F, US DOT 1966 Act, which has FHW review. Part of that earlier study we did is called a Phase 1 archaeological investigation. Historical Perspectives, who's our sub-consultant, did the work on behalf of the town through our contract. And in that, we came up with the findings that there are no historic properties going to be affected. There were no remnant railroad or historical or cultural issues for us to keep forward or minimize our work limits or identify restrictions of time of year or any certain species that we had to be careful of in the project corridor. Part of that review also goes through what's called a natural diversity database. It's an inventory of endangered species that are across the state of Connecticut. We review that with Connecticut Deep, and to make sure that any of our work is not occurring in an area that would need limitations. If they did have restrictions, oftentimes those restrictions are time of year where you can't clear trees during certain times of year, or you can't do certain noise, whether it's a bat habitat or an owl or a turtle or those kind of crossings. But in those investigations, those needs will not be required for this project. Going to go through the existing conditions for a moment. This screen shows, again, a little zoomed in area of an aerial photo of the intersection of Depot Street and French Street. You can see seems like the cursor laser disappears when it hits the screen. But you can see the existing gravel trail where the Steele Brook Greenway is on your upper left, just above Depot Street. You can see the kind of gravel entrance driveway that comes down into where the town has a siphon chamber, or the Watertown Fire District has a siphon chamber underneath the river. The gravel area. That will be the formal location of the new entrance to a new driveway and parking lot that I'll show you in a moment. Just beyond that, you can start to see the reflective area below, just above that lower photo, which is Steele Brook as it turns, goes under French Street, turns and goes down along the old railroad bed, all the way down toward our project limits. Again, continuing down through this area, the alignment and the route of the project follows this existing clearing. So there's limited vegetation clearing that we need to do along this area to construct the trail, because we're working in that old railroad right-of-way and utility corridor that's there today. As you get a little bit further down, there is a wetland crossing, a little small water course that comes down from the street up above that we'll be checking out the condition of that pipe to make sure it's adequate, and then crossing the trail over that, potentially replacing that pipe. As we continue down to the south again, you can see Watertown Plaza on the opposite side of Steele Brook, the clearing and the pathway area that we'll be working in just above that. As we get down to the more southern end, you can start to see Unico Fields pull into our field of view. Unico Fields, and there's a path that goes above it and below it in that area. And as we went through our preliminary design assessment, we looked at a couple alternatives of where we wanted to put the trail, either up above in this area or down below along the river, and you'll see in a moment what we came up with. Again, continuing, the alignment of the trail is pretty well defined in the aerial photos. We're going to be following that generally all the way through this area. And as we get down to the bottom, again, Unico Fields, the existing gravel parking lot, the existing bridge over Steele Brook that takes you to the dog park. There's the existing gravel path that goes down to the existing pedestrian bridge that currently crosses over Steele Brook, and up above, off the screen, would be Watertown High School with a much higher elevation than we are at this particular project. Here's our kind of a rendered opinion of what we think the project would look like. For just some information, we've identified the trail route in a yellow. The green areas are areas where we're doing fill, which is an embankment or filling in the material. When we get into areas that are more structural, like concrete and bridge, they're shown in orange. And then we also have the wetland and watercourse boundary shown in blue. And then there's also some floodplain lines, which are a little bit difficult to see on this scale, but they follow along the Steele Brook as we work through the project corridor. Those are important to consider because we're trying to avoid wetland impacts. We're trying to avoid floodplain impacts as part of the project to minimize the permitting needed for this. In this area, you'll also notice that we've identified a little detail in the bottom left-hand corner for what's called a rectangular rapid flashing beacon. It is a dedicated pedestrian crossing button that's pushed. Currently, there's a crosswalk up at Westbury, and we'll be proposing to remove that crosswalk and then focus pedestrian traffic at the Greenway here. That signage will have advanced signage. That's a flashing button, so when it gets activated, it flashes to make a more pronounced location and safer location for pedestrians to cross French Street. In this image as well, you'll also notice that we're proposing a small parking lot to serve this end of the trail. We have the parking lot at the southern end near Unico Fields that'll be offered for access, but we wanted to provide some access at this location as well for users in this area. Again, as we continue down, we are following that corridor. The brown colors indicate areas of cut or excavation that we need to do. We're trying to balance our cut and fill materials so we don't have any increase in floodplain fill, and we don't want to have any impacts in the wetlands that have been delineated in the area. I'm going to go back to this bridge for a moment. In this location here too is that we are proposing to completely span the FEMA floodplain. We are not proposing to provide any encroachment within the channel, whether it's the wetlands, the watercourse, or the floodplain, to minimize our impacts. And we know how flashy Steele Brook can be in rainstorms. We were out here a couple times during a couple of events, and we don't want to exacerbate any flooding that may be occurring in the area by creating a constriction in the floodplain in that area. So we're well beyond that area. As part of our next stage of design, we're going to go through a detailed hydraulic analysis to make sure that that is the case with the final design. And again, moving south along, this kind of shows some of the watercourse areas a little bit more clearly. There's also that green line that runs parallel to the trail is the existing town of Watertown sewer line that comes down used to go all the way down to the plant that was just south of Unico Fields. Above that, and a little bit off the screen, not highlighted here, was also Watertown Fire District also has a separate sewer line that comes down and joins together eventually further downstream. Again, very straightforward when it comes to this section of trail. You start to see a little bit more activity in this area. In this area, as we come from the flat area along the brook and we want to transition up to the upper path, this project is being designed in accordance with the American Disabilities Act to make sure that all users can access it, which means we can't propose a trail grade of more than 5%. This particular gravel access that cuts across right now from upper to lower is about 19%. So we have to kind of build an embankment and fill up a little bit to make a gradual slope come from the bottom of the elevation at the lower side of Unico Fields to the upper level. And from that area as well is that we're proposing a 12-foot wide trail, paved bituminous concrete trail. The gravel trail out there in some areas is like 10 feet, so we have to widen a little bit. We've got to do a little bit of grading of the earth next to the areas of the trail left and right. If you've been up to that area, there's some overland flow that comes off the hill that washes across the trail and creates a little bit of erosion. Some of that cut and that brown you see there are areas where we're going to cut in a swale to make sure we direct water runoff to the existing pipes that are in that area. You can see in the thin blue line that comes from the larger blue line in the middle, the floodplain line starts to meander up into the middle of Unico Field as another reason why we chose to keep the trail outside the floodplain and not lower on the river side of the fields. There is a gravel path along that side, so it's still accessible for people if they should want to view these sporting events from the lower side. It's not restricted. It does get overgrown a little bit with vegetation, but it is an area that does have some sort of access from that side of the field. We also felt the benefit of being on the upper side of the trail here was to have a good vantage point of looking down over the playing fields. We do know that people will be potentially using this area to view the sporting events from up above. We're going to be taking a look at making a little bit of openings in some of the fencing we'll need there for safety. When I say fencing, it's a split rail fence to keep the trail users from going down the embankment. But making some openings so that people want to come in and sit on the upper bank and look at the sporting events and watch the sporting events, will still be able to do that if they do that now. What we'd rather not have anyone do is climb over those fences to get into the area to sit and watch the sporting events. And again, continuing down, you can start to see a lot of the different piping starting to cross. All this piping that comes through this area for sewers tends to collect down at this end of the trail. As we get down in gray, you'll see the existing parking lot. We are going to propose a small area of additional handicap. There is existing handicap in the upper, I believe, upper left-hand corner of this parking lot that feeds the Unico fields. But we want to make sure, again, for American Disabilities Act, that we provide access to this trail for all users. And there will be a small couple space parking spaces for the handicap vehicles at this upper right corner of the parking lot. In that area too, the trail does a little bit of a steep grade today, comes down about 9%. So we're going to be kind of doing a serpentine path as it comes down there to get the trail to 5% so we can maintain, again, access for all users. One of the topics we've had a discussion with DOT and VHB in the town is that this is a location where we cross Steele Brook with the existing bridge and we start to intersect with the trail at this location. We're going to expand the project coloring you see here to include a more formal crossing at that road so that people coming across the bridge will know there is a trail crossing ahead. We're actually going to pave a little apron on that side, on the southern side of that, to allow for this crossing of the trail to be kind of identified as a place for pedestrians to be. And then they'll continue as a gravel trail down the path to the existing pedestrian bridge to the south. As part of the project, and as I mentioned before, and I'm going to introduce Zach in a moment, potential right-of-way impacts we envision for the project. Most of the Greenway will be constructed within the abandoned railroad right-of-way. We understand portions of that land are in different stages of ownership. One area outside of that particular right-of-way itself is on the parcel just where we sweep up from the corner. So in this corner here where we transition from the lower grade to the upper grade, we do need an easement on that property to construct and maintain the trail. That existing gravel path exists on the other private property today, so we'll need a formal easement for the town to maintain and construct that portion of the trail. At this time, I'd like to introduce Zach Garino from Connecticut DOT Office of Rights of Way, who will go through what the state will be doing on behalf of the town to acquire any property rights that are needed.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can share the video, so. But my name is Zachary Garino. I'm a project coordinator with the department's Division of Rights of Way. Our office is responsible for acquiring the property rights that are needed for transportation projects. As mentioned in the presentation, this project will require the acquisition of property rights, so I'd like to give you a brief overview of our acquisition process. Before I begin, I'd like to mention that the specific impacts are still being finalized and may change as the design progresses, and that any required property rights will be acquired in accordance with Connecticut General Statutes, sections 13A73 and 13A98E, as well as the Uniform Act. Moving on to the right-of-way process. The right-of-way acquisition process begins once the design has progressed to a development milestone and all the impacts have been determined. At this point, each affected property owner will receive a formal letter of intent to acquire from our office along with a property map which depicts the exact property rights to be acquired. Next, our office will determine the fair market value of those property rights that were depicted on the map, which will be used to establish an offer of just compensation. That offer will be sent out to the property owner in writing, and a right-of-way agent will be available to meet with the property owner and explain the project, go over the specific impacts to their property, and explain how the state arrived at its offer. The property owner will be given a reasonable amount of time, typically 30 days, to consider the state's offer and enter into negotiations. When an agreement is reached, the department will prepare all the necessary paperwork to record the deed and property map on the town land records. However, if an agreement cannot be reached, in order to keep on schedule, the department may acquire the necessary property rights through its power of eminent domain. In that event, the state files a notice of condemnation in the Superior Court along with a monetary deposit in the amount of the state's offer. The owner would have 6 months from that date to file an appeal if they felt that the state's offer was inadequate. Whether or not the owner chooses to appeal, the money deposited in the court is available to be withdrawn by the owner. It's important to note that the state only acquires property rights that are needed for the project. If there are any questions regarding the right-of-way acquisition process, I'll be happy to answer them after the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. So what's next? As we go through this process, as I mentioned, we have 14 days to receive public comment. We will then go through the approval to proceed with final design. We have an interagency meeting with the state and the regulatory agencies in December or in January to go through and make sure the permit applications that we're going to submit are understood and accurate, and we can move forward. We will then also begin the right-of-way acquisition process. That takes some time, so we want to make sure we get that process moving soon. This is our semi-final designs phase we get into, which is a part of final design. We get to about 60%, which gets us into permit applications, both local, federal, and state. And we start kind of chipping away at the final design of this thing as we get more and more fine-tuned with our details. We'll do a type study for the structure as well to make sure that the type structure, the pedestrian bridge, is the most prudent and feasible alternative to crossing the river and most cost-effective. Currently, right now, we are in our budget for the project is at $2.8 million. That number includes both the construction costs and the oversight for inspection and contingencies on top of those costs to make sure there's a buffer for any unforeseen conditions. Then we get into advertising for construction and contractor selection. Once the right-of-way acquisitions are completed and the permits are in hand and the final design has been approved. Right now, we're expecting. Again, this is an updated date. We're looking at a December 2024 advertisement date for the project in the construction through the 2025 construction season. That's the current schedule that we have for the project. Go as advertised in the fall in December of 2024 with construction in the following year. We don't expect that it would take more than 1 year to construct this project. There is some lead time with the pedestrian bridge. It takes time for that to be manufactured, but we don't expect that to be delayed beyond the construction season. So we would expect probably a 6 to 8 month duration beginning in April of that year. As we mentioned before, and again, I do have business cards here if you'd like to take one. The comment period is open, but again, tonight, this is a public information meeting and your opportunity to ask questions and provide input for the project. And at this time, I would love to open it up to the public to raise any questions or concerns or comments they might offer. What we'll do is that when you offer your comment, we will do a quick readback to make sure the record captures your comment, and then we'll try to answer it as best we can. First, I'd like to start with any municipal officials who might have any comments or questions or input they would like to provide for the project and the record. If no, I'll take questions from the audience. Yes, ma'am. That is one of the criteria. It's not ultimately necessary for that to be. There's different paving opportunities that can be pursued as part of that. But in order for it to be truly accessible for wheelchairs and also for different users, you're trying to accommodate all users, rollerbladers, bicyclists, those kind of things. And that's a difficult surface to travel on. So it's a multi-use trail. You're trying to support all users. So ADA not necessarily has to be paved. but the all-user mentality. There's no motor vehicles allowed on the trail, even posting for certain types of motor vehicles and electronic scooters that are out there today. There are different classes of that, and those are the assisted bicycles. So if someone has an assisted electric bicycle, there's a certain class for that. But like mopeds and ATVs are not incorporated or not permitted. At the either end of the trail and at the entrance to the bridge, there's going to be bollards that'll be closed to prevent vehicles from driving into the trail. And in those areas, so those will be collapsible so that emergency services can come in and maintenance vehicles can come in as well. The bridge itself is going to be rated for light-duty vehicles, so ambulances can come through that area should they need to come and access that area to react to an incident. That is the intent originally, and what we've also looked at too is we want to make sure that it's able to be maintained in a way so that if there any graffiti or anything that comes, that can be cleaned easily. One of the options is to make sure that we maintain some sort of theme on the trail as we move forward. This is the first more formal section that's going to be, so there are some discussions happening. We are going to be matching the benches that are out there now. We're going to be matching some of the solar lighting for safety up at the parking lot. We're going to be matching the signage that you saw in the earlier part of the presentation. There's a lot of features like that we're going to tie in. So technically right now the bridge is being designed with the hope that it'll be a similar type feature that the one is downstream. I noticed on that particular bridge as well, I believe NVCOG has trail markers, trail counters that are attached to the bridge to keep as part of the bike census they've been doing to keep track of how much users. So I would imagine that trip counter is going to go up pretty high when this becomes a thorough corridor all the way through to French Street. What's interesting is that in 2021, there was the event where the dam downstream breached and changed the hydraulic grade line and the profile of the flooding in the river a little bit. Some anecdotal information says that it's been a little bit better, lower than the bridge near the dog park. The bridge at the dog park is a constriction. Hydraulically, it traps water there too, and Steele Brook is so flat from that bridge all the way back up to French Street. So that's the area that needs probably the more attention. I know the town's been looking into some sediment deposition removal that's been built up over time in that area. That's a permitting issue that needs to go through. It's not included in this project. That would change the scope and the funding requirements quite a bit to get into that, and the timeline to do that would take quite a bit of time. But there has been discussion for that. As far as invasive species, there's a Japanese knotweed that's out there. There are methods to help control that. If we're not disturbing it as part of our project, or we're not going to be including any mitigation for it, but there are options for that to happen in the future. Any area that we're working near will likely have to deal with that. So when we cross over the bridge to make sure that that area doesn't get choked up with those invasive species, that will be an area we can work in. But again, we're trying to stay out of regulatory areas of wetlands, and most of that invasive species is in a regulated area that we're trying to not impact for other important reasons as well. So I'm just going to reiterate your questions again. Is that, your last question was the what's being done about flooding in Steele Brook. The other question was, does the trail need to have ADA paved to be ADA accessible as part of those areas, and the bridges themselves, are they going to match the existing bridge that's out there? And again, then I think I've answered those clearly enough. If I didn't, let me know and I can elaborate further. Yes, sir. They will be. We submitted a hydrology report to Connecticut DOT, which is the first stage of our overall drainage analysis. So that initial hydrology report's been submitted and approved by DOT. The next stage is we're going to go through a detailed hydraulic analysis of Steele Brook, especially at our crossing where we're proposing the bridge, to identify it. There have been previous studies of the brook that have been performed, I believe, by WMC for the Steele Brook. That'll be consulted as part of that effort to make sure that what was happening then. We've even spoken about getting additional survey of where the dam breached as part of maybe a different effort with the town, because what's happening out there now is there's a big rock outcropping that kind of creates the next impoundment before the water can get down over that little bit of a waterfall. So there's a few things to look at in an area, but again, even discussing potentially improvements to the bridge near the dog park, because that is the next hydraulic constriction that reduces flow through the area. If you're out there during a storm, you can see the difference in the way the water flows upstream of that bridge, and once it gets downstream, it starts to take off a little bit from that area. So we want to, if there's ever a project in the future, that bridge would have to be looked at as far as its hydraulic capacity to make sure it doesn't continue to have other problems in the area. I know a lot of the businesses on this side of the brook going toward Main Street experience quite a bit of flooding fairly frequently. They're actually even lower than Unico Fields in most of the areas. The project itself will have special provision and specifications and items for the remediation of any materials that are found during construction. The programs have adapted a little bit to just include those remediation efforts in the construction project. They're finding that a lot of times the investigation of that material costs more than some of the remediations. So what they've done is they've required the projects have those specifications and those items for removal in the contract, incorporated into the contract with an allowance for it right up front. That's part of what the specifications require, is that they hire a licensed professional to identify that as they're doing the work. I understand your concern, and I would like to have, if Mark Jewell's on the phone today, to contribute a little bit to this, because part of this is tied into the program of the project and how they approach these projects in relation specifically to your concerns. So I'd like to have that comment for the record as well. Yeah. Yep. Is Mark available to speak? Yep.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So was the question about the Task 210, Mike?
Yes.
Yeah, I think you answered it fairly well. The soil specification that's going to be included is one where when if the contractor suspects or tests soil, it that proves to be hazardous or dirty in any way will then be disposed of, and we'll have those allowances in that contract. I didn't hear online. I didn't hear the original question, but
I'm going to
I thought you
reiterate.
answered it fairly well.
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate a couple different of your questions because you had several that were very good. One of which is, were we aware of any previous studies that were conducted on the on Steele Brook? One of which, there's two that you mentioned. One of which was 1980s, that identified improvements along the corridor to widen the channel to improve flood capacity for those areas. And we are aware of those studies. We have some of those studies as well. We'll confirm if we have the one you have. I do want to address that particular. We are analyzing this corridor for our project. We are not encroaching on the channel banks or the wetlands that are associated with Steele Brook, and we're far enough away from those areas where that future widening and channel excavation can grow. So we're not so constrictive. That's why we're giving ourselves room to outside the floodplain, not right up against the regulatory limits. We're going further than that to make sure that we get. That's why we're doing an 85-foot long bridge and not a 55-foot long bridge, so that we have room in the future for what the Steele Brook is going to experience. We know the rainfall intensities are increasing. We know climate change is an issue. So we're giving ourselves that buffer of space. The other areas that are in there, that there should be plenty of width to widen those channels. A big part of the problem in that flat section is sediment deposition that's been occurring from runoff over the years. Another one of your questions, the one we just were speaking about, was that given the use of arsenic on controlling invasive vegetation along railroad right-of-ways historically, has any environmental investigations been done of that? The Task 210, which is typically what's called like a windshield survey, is I believe has already been performed by the Connecticut DOT as part of administering the project, which basically says we believe there to be a concern because of the historic use that's been in the area. It's like if you're near a dry cleaner, if you're near other areas, the probability for a concern is there. They moved right into incorporating allowances into the contract for that work to be done. We are doing a lot of work that's above grade and not doing as much a lot of earth excavation in those railroad abandoned areas as well. So again, as Mark had mentioned, the specification is there, the items are there, the quantities are there, and the allowance is there to address it during construction. It is a shift from different policies where they used to do the different task all the way through before you get, so you can identify the specific hot areas. But they've found that it's more effective and cost effective to include an allowance to address it along the entire corridor than just spot improvements here and there. I don't believe there would be any harm, and it's a topic that's been brought up, and this is why we're doing the public information meeting, is that this goes back, we incorporate it, we communicate with DOT and the funding sources to say, should we do this now? So this is why this comment's so important at this public meetings, because we're gonna consider it and respond to it appropriately. And if the parties of B feel like it's important to do it now, outside of a current policy that's being implemented, then it'll be done now. But that's why we solicit this comment from you. Again, I'm sorry for your loss of your friend, and I appreciate the passionate question for this meeting. This is why we're doing this. This is exactly why we're doing this. So we're going to talk internally. We're going to talk with DOT about your concern, your question, and see if we can implement that. Yes. Yeah. Part of our initial hydrology report was we didn't do just a stream strats calculation. It was part of a larger hydrologic analysis of the watershed area based upon the previous studies that have also been prepared as well. Our next stage is to go into that HEC-RAS analysis, which is a more detailed analysis, as you know. But for those who aren't familiar with that, the hydraulic analysis zooms in and specifically looks at the hydraulic characteristics of the channel, the bridge, all the features, the floodplain banks, all the exact topographic information that we've surveyed. We took specific cross sections up and down the river so we can actually model the shape of that river that are both bank survey shots but also bathymetric shots, so we know the shape of the channel and we can analyze it specifically and run that in the HEC-RAS program, which does a more detailed analysis, real-world analysis of what we're looking at here to make the right recommendation. And if those results indicate we need to make some mitigation, to make some changes, that might be something we need to do. But that's the analysis we go. We haven't done that yet. That's our next stage. It's once we get into semi-final design to understand exactly what we're proposing in relation to existing. Obviously, we're not required to. This project is not out there to fix Steele Brook. Our limitation is that we are not required to exacerbate or make any additional problems. That analysis that we do will also be able to be used in the future to determine if other improvements to Steele Brook can be done. So each one of these analyses over the years can build upon each other to ultimately lead to hopefully maybe a project one day that can address some of those concerns. But this project is not scoped to fix Steele Brook. We just need to make sure that what we're proposing doesn't make it worse from what you have today. That's our limitation. In your comment and question doesn't fall on deaf ears. There's actually conversations we've had specifically about that. There's two different sides of that. One is to also identify improvements that can reflect what needs to be fixed, but also identify if you can make improvements and also change floodplain limits. That affects property owners and insurance rates and all kinds of other things. So there's a lot of reasons why it's a good idea to do that, not only to address any flooding concerns, but also if things are mapped inappropriately. There's been a lot of changes to that brook since the dam washed out, and there could be a reason why it might be advantageous to look at it again. So I agree with your comments. This project, it doesn't have the scope. It's not just the scope of services. It's the funding source is not scoped to deal with that issue here. They have to apply for the funding, and the funding is not geared toward Streambrook. It's a trail enhancement program, and that program doesn't fund what you were speaking of. But there are other funding programs that might. So as an engineer, yes, would I like to see it fixed and have a scope of services to do that? Absolutely. But not under this program. It's not something we're doing right now. But thank you. Very good comments. Yes, sir. Let me go to the more zoomed in view that you didn't get the chance to see before. So I think part of where you're indicating is that right where the Unico Fields splits, where the gravel trail comes back down off the top level, it does come across the corner of private property in that gravel area currently right now, and then the additional Watertown Fire District sewer line that continues on a parallel path back up to French Street. Currently, there's no restriction for anyone to go to stay within those limits once they're on Unico Field or on the town's property. As part of that, we are going to be. We are. prior to your arrival to the meeting, we were talking about the rights-of-way acquisition process. So what's going to happen during this next stage is that Connecticut DOT is going to be administering and processing the right-of-way acquisition review. As part of that process, they go through a detailed title search, where they look at the titles and deeds that are on each property to see what rights are existing and available, what's subject to is there an easement for this, or an easement for sewer, what rights, who owns it, make sure the abutters are known, because we'll ultimately need to prepare right-of-way maps and easements for areas where the design encroaches onto those other areas. So we'll know more as we go through that under the next stage of the project, who owns what officially, what other deeds are on the property. The title search is a much more detailed investigation than just a typical one property survey. So that title search is going to bring everything forward to make sure that everyone we're dealing with are the current owners, and we know all the limitations and restrictions around those properties so we can deal with them in our final design. That's why we do that title search very soon after this meeting, so that we know where we're doing things in case we have to adjust our design, not later on. So I can't answer the easement question to you yet. We do know those lines exist. We've seen the construction documents that show the profile of those pipes. We know where they are. We've surveyed them. The question is that what rights do exist today and what limitations, and we'll know that once we get into the right-of-way acquisition process. Understood, and I think that issue is tied to more enforcement of encroachments as opposed to what this project is proposing. So I think it's a related issue, but I think some of the access issues that are being created by a paper road or another driveway is more of an enforcement item that this project probably can't solve for that, but your comment is in the record in a public meeting, so it's been captured. And just to reiterate that, because I mentioned before, I want to make sure your comment is heard for the record, is that do we know who owns the property? Is there an easement on the upper sewer line that cuts through? And also, what limitations are there to keeping people from trespassing on other properties? As I answered, we'll go through the right-of-way process to understand the limitations. If there's areas where we need to make some sort of adjustment to the design to not encourage access to those areas, we'll take a look at that during final design. If there's anything we can do, whether it's just some landscaping or some other features, maybe it's a couple boulders or something like that that can block access so people aren't encouraged to go there. We can't prevent access on private property from people. People will do what they want to do, but if we can encourage it to go elsewhere, I think the good part about building this trail is that you're bringing a lot more stewardship to the area. Right now, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind when you get in this area. So when you bring people who are traveling the corridor through and really are intended to travel the corridor through, we've found that the trails do better when it comes to the illegal activities because you've got more eyes, you've got more people looking at the activities as opposed to an area back here, which is beautiful and pristine in some areas, but it is remote, and you're not going to have someone's eyes looking at it. So the people who are going to be encouraged to stay on the trail more, the more you use it. So that's what we've experienced on trail designs, that the more you use it, the more people tend to behave with staying within the corridor. Everything else is enforcement. So the question that came up again was, why did we jog it down and why didn't we keep it along the lower side of the field, along the brook? In the earlier part of the presentation, our earlier alternative analysis looked at both of those, whether we go up above or down below. If we go down below, we're entirely within the floodplain along that section of the brook and up against that area that you talked about before as being prone to flooding. And we wanted to make sure we were outside of the area. We get very close to wetlands in that area. And it's a difficult, tighter area to work when you want to try to provide a 12-foot wide shared use path. It's as I mentioned during the earlier presentation, there's room for that to be a pedestrian gravel area, should people want to view that side of the field from that side. We're not prohibiting access to that area. There's kind of a gravel area there now. But we believe that the route would be more sustainable on the upper level, provides a better vantage point if people want to look at the field and look at the events from there. So it's kind of a mixed benefit for being up on top. And again, we're out of the floodplain. The floodplain tends to start to cross to the middle of the field in that location, so we're trying to stay out of that. Yep. And as I mentioned during, just for the sake of what you missed before, is that gravel path that comes down now is a pretty steep grade, and because our trail's being designed for multi-use and American Disabilities Act, we're going to be flattening that grade by filling a little bit as we get into the railroad property, so we can have a more gradual transition through that area, so it's not so steep, and it's not subject to the erosion that you see in that gravel path that's out there today. Yes, sir. Yeah, just to summarize, the comment was in support of the project and looking forward to using this as a resident in town. It feels like it could be a benefit to the area. Yes, sir. We are. I'm not the hydraulic engineer on the project, but our hydraulic engineer on the project. And we do, and just to reiterate the questions that the previous studies talked about using part of Unico Field as a flood shelf for additional flood storage in the area as part of that. Again, in the previous reports, the WMC, our current engineer, that's our hydraulic engineer leading that, is actually a former WMC employee, very familiar with that study as well, has seen it, has looked at it as part of, he's involved with the HEC-RAS analysis on this project as well. So again, there's a continuity of hydraulic engineers that are involved as part of this project. I can't speak to that. But like I said, the hydraulic engineers have been involved in those previous studies, one of which is working on our project team for this project. So, as a DOT approved hydraulic engineer, so like all of this stuff, and just so you know too, is that we do a couple things when it comes to this design. Is that we look at not only what FEMA regulates and that's dictated as flow in this area for the FEMA floodplain regulations. So we'll need a Connecticut DEP flood management certificate for this project to be approved. But as part of that too, we go through a hydrology and hydraulic analysis using Connecticut DOT policies and Connecticut DOT drainage manual, which is a little more stringent. It looks at the impacts to these areas using real world hydraulic analysis data that's not FEMA-based. FEMA-based could go back to 1971, 80s. Some of those numbers are very, very old, and they haven't been updated in years. We're required to use current stream hydrology, current watershed, current rainfall intensities that have been recommended by NOAA not something that's been used back in 1970. So we're looking at today's, and those have increased. Those numbers have increased over the last several years. So we're using the current best available data to analyze this thing. That's what DOT requires us to do. FEMA and DEP require us to follow the regulatory limit, which is a FEMA limit. When we do our hydraulic analysis, the hydraulic analysis could be different than what FEMA shows. And we have to demonstrate that we're not making it worse from what we are calculating. So if they come back and let's just say the water surface elevation in FEMA is here, and our analysis tells us it's here, we have to design to make sure we're not impacting that higher level. But thank you. I understand your question. And again, that next part of our phase of our design gets into all of that detail in history. Again, this is your night, so if any questions, and again, I'll remind anyone to either email me, as my cards are here, with any questions in the next 14 days should something come to mind. We've already got a couple of emails already. One email was indicating, could we use, and I'll forward this on for the record as well, could there be certain markings in the trail so people can identify should there be an issue? I need some help. I'm on the orange line. Could we color code different sections of the trail to accommodate quicker access for emergency services to find someone or to report your location should you have a concern for something? So again, those kind of ideas, both technical, both community-based, are encouraged during this process so we can create something you're proud of. Yes. And again, for those who are listening online, it applies to you too. This presentation's on the town's website. My email address is in there for that. Cards are here. Please, if you have any ideas, feel free to look out. We will try to address anything reasonable in the course of the design, and as long as the funding allows, to the extent that we can. No other comments online or from the audience. I'd like to thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. Look forward to working, with you on these questions and providing answers that hopefully address your concerns. Thank you.
Recording stopped.